The Vampire King's hand shot up the instant he saw the albino girl dragged onto the platform in chains. Her father grinned, counting money. Except the king wasn't buying her as prey. His council had declared he must marry a human to secure the peace treaty, and only an albino could survive his venom without dying. Now she had 72 hours to choose, the auction block or a crown she never wanted. The guards gripped her arms with professional detachment as they hauled her up the wooden steps, and Alara felt the splinters dig into her bare feet through the gaps in the platform boards. The auction square reeked of unwashed bodies and desperation, the kind of place where human refuse was sold to the highest bidder, and she had become exactly that. Her white hair hung in matted tangles around her face, and she kept her violet eyes downcast because meeting anyone's gaze only brought whispers of curse and demon spawn. The rope burns on her wrists had crusted over with dried blood, souvenirs from 3 days locked in her father's cellar while he arranged this transaction. She wore the same tattered gray dress she had worn to her mother's funeral 3 months ago, the hem now black with mud, and the bodice torn at the shoulder where Marcus had grabbed her when she tried to run. The auction master, a fat man with gin blossoms spreading across his nose, yanked her forward by the chain attached to the iron collar around her neck. She stumbled, but did not fall because falling would mean more bruises, and she had enough of those already. The crowd murmured as they always did when they saw her. That mixture of fascination and revulsion that had followed her since childhood. Ghost child, they called her. Cursed one. The girl too pale to be human. Her mother had called her beautiful, had braided her white hair with gentle fingers, and told her that different did not mean damaged. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. But her mother was 3 months dead of fever, and Marcus had spent exactly 1 week in mourning before he started talking about selling the burden he never wanted. Alara had heard him through the thin walls of their cottage, counting the money he would get, planning what he would buy with the price of his daughter. She scanned the crowd without hope, seeing the usual mix of flesh traders and pleasure house owners, men who bought girls like merchandise and used them until they broke. Then she saw him. The Vampire King sat in the back row of the bidding section, an area reserved for nobility and the truly wealthy, and he was so still he might have been carved from marble. White hair fell past his shoulders, paler even than hers, and when he lifted his head their eyes met across the crowd. His were crimson, the color of fresh blood, and they did not hold hunger or cruelty, but something far more unsettling. Exhaustion. The kind of weariness that came from centuries of bearing weight no one else could carry. He wore a black formal coat with silver threading that caught the torchlight, and the other bidders gave him a wide berth as if his presence alone created a barrier. Alara knew what he was instantly because everyone in the human territories knew what vampires looked like, the unnatural beauty and the predator stillness that marked them as other. The auction master began his pitch, listing her attributes like she was livestock. Young, he said. Intact, he added with a leer that made her skin crawl. Albino, he finished, and that word brought a fresh wave of muttering. Some in the crowd made warding signs against evil. Others leaned forward with increased interest because rare things commanded higher prices. Marcus stood at the edge of the platform counting a handful of coins, probably money he had already borrowed against her sale, and he would not look at her. He had not looked at her since the day he locked her in the cellar. The bidding started at 50 gold sovereigns and climbed quickly. A pleasure house owner from the Eastern District offered 200. A flesh trader from the coast countered with 300. Marcus was grinning now, already calculating his profit, already planning his celebration. Then the Vampire King raised one pale hand, and the entire square fell silent. 500 gold sovereigns, the auction master sputtered. Do I hear 500? Marcus practically vibrated with greed. 1,000, the vampire said, and his voice carried across the square without him raising it, a sound like stone grinding against stone. The auction master's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. 1,000 gold sovereigns for the girl, he finally managed. Going once. The crowd had gone utterly still. Going twice. No one else bid because no one bid against vampire royalty unless they wanted to start a war, sold to King Kalen of the Northern Territories. Alara felt something inside her crack at those words, some last fragile hope that perhaps this was all a nightmare from which she might wake. The guards released her arms and she swayed, legs weak from 3 days of minimal food and water. The vampire king rose from his seat and moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water around a stone. He was tall, far taller than any human man she had known, and he moved with the fluid grace of something that had hunted for centuries. When he reached the platform, he did not climb the steps, but simply looked at her, really looked, and she felt weighed and measured in a way that had nothing to do with flesh. "You need not fear me," he said quietly, and it was the last thing she expected to hear. His guards materialized from the shadows, 4 of them wearing dark uniforms marked with a moon and thorn crest, and they surrounded her with professional efficiency. One of them unlocked the collar from her neck, and she gasped as the weight lifted, hand going to the bruised skin beneath. Another wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, fine black wool that smelled of cedar and something else she could not name. The vampire king handed a leather purse to the auction master, who opened it with shaking hands and nearly dropped it when he saw the glint of gold inside. Marcus pushed through the crowd, still grinning, hand outstretched as if expecting the vampire to shake it in congratulation. Kalen looked at him with such cold contempt that Marcus actually stepped back. "This is your daughter," the vampire said. "Not livestock, not refuse, your daughter. And you sold her for coins you will spend on drink and dice." Marcus's grin faltered. "She is cursed," he said defensively. "Bad luck. Everyone knows it." The vampire's crimson eyes seemed to glow faintly in the torchlight. "The only curse here is you," he said, and then he turned away as if Marcus no longer existed. The guards escorted Alara down the platform steps and through the crowd, and she was too shocked to resist, too stunned by the sudden reversal to do anything but walk. They led her to a black carriage that waited at the edge of the square, its sides lacquered to a mirror shine and marked with the same moon and thorn crest. One of the guards opened the door and helped her inside with a courtesy that felt surreal after days of chains and brutality. The interior was lined with burgundy velvet and smelled of leather and night air. Through the carriage window she caught one last glimpse of her father. He had already turned away from the platform and was heading toward the nearest tavern, the leather purse clutched in his fist, his grin restored now that he had his money. He did not look back, not once. The carriage lurched into motion, and Alara closed her eyes, feeling hot tears squeeze between her lids despite her best efforts. She had known her father did not love her, had known it for years, but seeing the proof so starkly displayed carved something out of her chest. The memory came unbidden, sharp and painful. Her mother's hands braiding her hair on summer mornings, gentle and sure. Her mother's voice singing old lullabies that spoke of moonlight and magic. Her mother's fierce protection when the village children threw stones and called her demon spawn, standing between them and her daughter like a shield. Then her mother's face, gaunt with fever, lips cracked and breath rattling. And Marcus standing in the doorway of the sick room, not helping, not comforting, just waiting for it to be over so he could be free of both of them. The funeral had been small. Afterward, Marcus had looked at her across the grave and said, "You are a burden I never wanted." 1 week later, he began making arrangements for the auction. The carriage rolled through the night and Alara opened her eyes to watch the landscape change outside the window. They left the human town of Ashford behind, passing through farmland and forest, climbing into hills she had never seen before. The moon rose full and bright, turning everything silver, and she thought about the vampire king's words, "You need not fear me." But she did fear him, because what else was there to feel when your whole life had just been purchased by a creature that drank blood to survive? What else was there to feel when you had no choice, no power, no future, except the one someone else had bought for you? The carriage crossed a bridge suspended over a gorge so deep she could not see the bottom, and ahead the palace rose against the night sky like something from a nightmare. Nighthaven, she had heard it called in whispered stories. The vampire citadel. Obsidian towers reached toward the stars, gothic spires and flying buttresses that seemed to defy gravity. No lights showed in the windows, but she could sense occupation, the weight of ancient presence. The carriage passed through gates that opened silently and rolled to a stop in a courtyard paved with black stone. A woman waited there, tall and elegant in deep purple gowns, her face sharp and ageless. She opened the carriage door herself and regarded Alara with eyes that had seen centuries pass. "I am Seraphine," she said, "advisor to the king. You will come with me." Alara climbed down on shaking legs and followed because what else could she do? The interior of the palace was vast and cold, all stone and shadow, and she noticed immediately that there were no mirrors anywhere. The windows were made of one-way glass that let occupants see out, but prevented anyone from seeing in. Seraphine led her through corridors that seemed to wind endlessly upward, past closed doors and silent halls, until they reached a tower room that took Alara's breath away. The Rose Tower suite was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in, velvet drapes and deep crimson-framed windows that overlooked a forest of black trees. A four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, covered in silk sheets and enough pillows to drown in. Wardrobes lined one wall, and when Seraphine opened them, Alara saw gowns in every color, fine fabrics she had never touched in her life. A balcony extended from the far side, offering a view of the Shadow Vale forest and the mountains beyond. It was beautiful. It was a prison. "Sit," Seraphine said, gesturing to a chair upholstered in cream silk. Alara sat because her legs would not hold her much longer. Seraphine poured wine from a crystal decanter and handed her a glass, then settled into the chair opposite. "Now," the vampire said, "I will explain why you are here." "The human-vampire peace accords were signed in 1823, she began, "and for 70 years they held. But radical factions on both sides grow stronger. Humans who want vampires exterminated, vampires who see humans as nothing more than food. War is coming unless we can prove that coexistence is possible." Alara sipped the wine, which was sweeter and richer than anything she had ever tasted. "The Vampire Council has mandated that King Kalen marry a human," Seraphine continued, "a symbolic union to demonstrate that our peoples can unite. But there is a complication." She leaned forward, crimson eyes intense. "Vampire venom is lethal to normal humans. It causes necrotic tissue death within minutes. Only those born without melanin, those you call albinos, have a biological immunity. The venom interacts differently with your blood chemistry. It will not kill you." Alara's hand went instinctively to her throat, to the bruises left by the collar. "You are the first viable candidate we have found in 3 years of searching," Seraphine said. "The king needs you. The treaty needs you. But ancient law protects you as well." She produced an ornate hourglass from the folds of her gown and set it on the table between them. "You have 72 hours to decide. If you consent to stay, to marry the king and complete the blood-binding ceremony, you will become queen. If you refuse, you will be released with 100 gold sovereigns and your freedom guaranteed. The law forbids us from forcing you." Alara stared at the hourglass, watching the first grains of sand begin their slow fall. "What happens if there is no marriage?" she asked, and her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Seraphine's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "War," she said simply. "The radicals will see it as proof that unity is impossible. They will attack. Thousands will die. Your father's village of Ashford will be among the first razed because it sits on the border. Ilara felt ice spread through her veins. So I have no choice. You have every choice, Seraphine corrected. But choices have consequences. That is the nature of power. The vampire rose and moved to the door. A guard waits outside. His name is Rowan, and he is young by our standards, barely a century old. He will not harm you. Food will be brought. Rest if you can. The king requests your presence at dinner, but you may refuse if you wish. Then she was gone, and Ilara was alone in a tower room more luxurious than anything she had imagined, wearing borrowed finery and holding the weight of thousands of lives in her trembling hands. She did not cry. She had no tears left. Instead, she walked to the balcony and looked out over the Shadow Vale forest, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns on the black trees. Somewhere in this palace was a vampire king who had bought her not as prey, but as a bride. Somewhere beyond these walls were people who would die if she chose freedom over duty. And somewhere in her chest was a tiny spark of rage that would not be extinguished. Her father had sold her because he saw her as worthless. The vampires needed her because of the very thing that made her different. The irony was not lost on her. Dinner came on a silver tray carried by a servant who would not meet her eyes. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, soft cheese, berries that tasted like summer, wine that made her head swim. She ate ravenously because her body did not care about politics or fate, it only knew hunger. She had not eaten properly in months, not since her mother died, and Marcus stopped pretending to care. Afterward, she tried to sleep but could not, her mind racing with impossible choices and uncertain futures. Finally, as midnight approached, she left the Rose Tower suite. The guard Rowan was indeed outside her door, a young-looking vampire with kind eyes who nodded as she passed but did not stop her. She wandered the palace corridors, following candlelight and instinct, until she found a library hidden behind a carved oak door. The room was vast, filled with books from floor to ceiling, and in the center sat the vampire king. He was reading by candlelight, completely absorbed in a leather-bound volume, and he looked so profoundly alone that Ilara hesitated before entering. He glanced up as she approached and closed the book. "Human philosophy," he said, showing her the cover. "I find it helps me remember what I am trying to protect." She sat in the chair across from him without being invited, exhaustion making her bold. "You did not want this either," she said. "It was not a question." "No," he admitted. "The council forced my hand. They believe a symbolic marriage will prevent war. I am not convinced of their reasoning, but I am bound by their decision." He set the book aside and looked at her with those crimson eyes that held centuries of weariness. "I am tired of war, tired of being a symbol, tired of watching people die for politics and pride. But I am also a king, and I do not have the luxury of my own desires." "Why me?" Ilara asked. "Because biology chose you," he said. "Because you are albino, and therefore immune to venom that would kill anyone else. Because I have searched for 3 years and found no one else. Because fate, or chance, or cruel coincidence put you on that auction block tonight." She studied him in the candlelight, this ancient creature who looked barely older than she was, and saw the scars on his wrist half hidden by his sleeve. "What happened there?" she asked. He followed her gaze and pulled back the fabric, revealing white scar tissue that looked like it had been burned into his flesh. "Assassination attempt," he said. 2 years ago. Radical vampires who believe the treaty is weakness. They use silver chains blessed by human priests. It nearly worked." He met her eyes steadily. "I need this marriage to work. Not for me. For the 10,000 souls in the border villages who will burn if we fail. For the humans and vampires who want peace but have no voice. I need it to work because the alternative is rivers of blood and decades of slaughter." Alara felt something shift inside her, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. This was not a monster. This was a man, or whatever vampires counted as men, trapped by the same weight of duty and obligation that now pressed on her shoulders. He did not want her as prey or property. He wanted her as a tool to prevent catastrophe. It was still using her, still making her a means to an end, but at least it was honest. "I have not agreed to anything," she said. "I know," he replied, "and I will not force you. The law protects you and I will honor it. But I hope you will consider what is at stake." She stood to leave and paused at the door. "I was called cursed my whole life. Ghost child, demon spawn. My own father sold me like livestock because I was different. Now you tell me that difference is the only thing that makes me valuable." The irony is almost funny. "It is not your difference that makes you valuable," Kaelin said quietly. "It is your choice. Anyone can be born albino. Only you can decide what to do with that accident of birth." She left without responding because she had no answer yet. Back in the Rose Tower suite, she found Seraphine waiting with the hourglass. The vampire set it on the mantel where Alara could see it constantly. 60 hours remain," Seraphine said, and then she too was gone. Alara stood at the window watching the moon set beyond the mountains and felt the weight of those 60 hours pressing down like stones. "Choice," the vampire king had said. But what kind of choice was it when one option meant war and death for thousands? What kind of choice when her own desires counted for nothing against the magnitude of consequence? She thought about her mother's hands braiding her hair. She thought about Marcus counting his coins. She thought about the vampire king's scarred wrist and exhausted eyes. And she thought about the fact that for the first time in her 19 years, someone had called her valuable not in spite of what she was, but because of it. The sand fell grain by grain in the hourglass, and Alara watched it fall, counting down to a decision that would define not just her life, but the lives of thousands she would never meet. Somewhere in the palace, a vampire king sat alone in a library, reading human philosophy and hoping for peace. Somewhere beyond the walls, human and vampire radicals sharpened their weapons and waited for war. And somewhere in between stood a girl who had been sold for being different and now held the fragile hope of two peoples in her pale, scarred hands. Alara woke to sunlight streaming through the tower windows, pale golden light that seemed wrong somehow in a vampire palace, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed back and she sat up in the silk sheets, her heart pounding against her ribs. A piece of parchment lay on the bedside table, folded once, sealed with black wax, stamped with the moon and thorn crest. She broke the seal and unfolded it, finding elegant script that flowed across the page like calligraphy. "No decision required today," it read. "But if you are willing, I would like to show you what you would be queen of. The choice remains yours." It was signed simply with a C. Alara dressed in one of the gowns from the wardrobe, choosing the simplest one she could find, a dove-gray dress that felt too fine against her skin. She braided her white hair herself, refusing to summon servants, and descended the tower stairs to find Kaelin waiting in the corridor below. He wore black again, but less formal than the night before, a simple shirt and trousers that somehow made him look more approachable. "Shall we?" he asked, and offered his arm. She took it because refusing seemed childish, and they walked through the palace together while he explained its history and purpose. The Hall of Echoes was vast and circular, a domed chamber where 12 thrones sat arranged in a perfect circle, each carved from a different type of stone, obsidian and marble and granite and jade, each representing one of the ancient vampire bloodlines. The acoustics were strange, designed so that a whisper from any throne would carry to all the others, ensuring no secret could be kept in council. "This is where we govern," Kaelin said, "where decisions are made that affect both our peoples." His voice echoed softly, multiplying until it seemed a dozen kings spoke at once. The blood archives were underground, reached by a spiral staircase that descended deep into the bedrock beneath the palace. The air grew cold as they descended, and Alara shivered despite the warmth of her gown. The archive chamber was lined with glass cases containing ancient documents, treaties, and declarations written on parchment that had yellowed with age. Some were inscribed in ink, but others, Kaelin explained, were written in preserved blood because certain oaths required that permanence. The original peace accords of 1823 hung in the center case, the signatures of human kings and vampire lords mingling on yellowed parchment, sealed with wax and blood in equal measure. "My grandfather signed this," Kaelin said quietly, his finger hovering near the glass above a flowing signature. "He believed peace was possible. I am trying to prove him right." The sunken gardens were a revelation, a vast underground conservatory where nocturnal flowers bloomed in perpetual twilight. Moonflowers and night jasmine, ghost orchids and shadow roses, all of them glowing faintly with bioluminescence that painted the garden in shades of blue and silver. The air smelled of earth and growing things, alive in a way the rest of the palace was not. Alara walked among the flowers, touching petals that felt like silk against her fingers, and for the first time since arriving, she felt something close to peace. "We cannot survive in sunlight," Kaelin said, watching her explore. "But we still need beauty, still need something living to remind us what we protect." They encountered Lord Theron in the Hall of Echoes on their return, a tall vampire with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of black ice. He was ancient, his presence heavy with accumulated centuries, and when he looked at Alara his lip curled in undisguised contempt. "So this is the pet," he said, his voice cold and precise. "The king's desperate solution. Tell me, girl, do you even understand what you have stumbled into?" Alara met his gaze without flinching, channeling every ounce of stubborn pride her mother had taught her. "I understand that you are afraid," she said. "Afraid that peace might actually work and prove your hatred obsolete." Theron's eyes flashed, and for a moment she thought he might strike her. Kaelin stepped between them, his posture relaxed, but his voice carrying an edge of command. "Careful, Theron. She is under my protection, and ancient law shields her." The council member sneered, but backed away, sweeping from the hall with his robes billowing behind him. Alara released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You should not provoke him," Kaelin said, but there was something like approval in his tone. "He is dangerous." "So am I," Alara replied, surprising herself with the words. "I have survived 19 years being called cursed and worthless. I can survive one bitter old vampire." They met Lady Morgana in the gardens, a vampire woman with silver hair coiled in elaborate braids and eyes the color of smoke. She studied Alara with an intensity that felt maternal, rather than predatory, and when she spoke her voice held genuine warmth. "You have your mother's courage," she said, though Alara had no idea how she could know that. "I lost a daughter once, centuries ago, human, like you. Fever took her before I could turn her, and I have mourned her every day since." She touched Alara's cheek with cool fingers. "If you choose this path, child, know that some of us want it to succeed not for politics, but because we remember what it means to love across the divide." Kieran found them in the library later that afternoon. Kaelin's younger brother appearing suddenly with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he had been waiting for the perfect moment. He was beautiful in the way all vampires seem to be, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief, and he bowed to Alara with exaggerated courtesy. "The famous albino bride?" he said. "I had to see for myself if you were real or just another of my brother's political fantasies." "Kieran," Kaelin said warningly. "What?" the younger vampire said innocently. "I am being welcoming." He turned back to Alara with a grin that would have been charming if it had not felt so calculated. "Fair warning," he said. "My brother is married to duty, not people. He will do what is right for the kingdom even if it destroys him personally. Just thought you should know what you are signing up for. That is enough, Kalen said, his voice hard. Kieran shrugged and vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Alara with more questions than answers. In the evening, Seraphine took her to a private chamber, where she demonstrated the properties of vampire venom in a controlled setting. A glass vial containing clear liquid that looked harmless, a few drops placed on a piece of raw meat that began smoking and blackening instantly, the flesh turning necrotic before Alara's eyes. This is what our venom does to normal human tissue, Seraphine explained. Death within minutes, agony within seconds. She produced a second vial and held out her hand. May I? Alara extended her arm and watched as the vampire placed a single drop of venom on her inner wrist. She braced for pain but felt only cold, a sensation like ice water spreading across her skin. Then came the silver shimmer, that same faint glow she had seen before, and the venom absorbed into her skin, leaving no mark behind. Kalen had been watching from across the room, and Alara saw his shoulders relax fractionally, saw relief flicker across his face. If I am immune, Alara asked slowly, could other albinos be turned into vampires? The question hung in the air like a blade. Seraphine's expression became carefully neutral. Theoretically, yes, she said. The venom would not kill you during the turning process as it does normal humans, but the Council forbids it. Creating vampires with immunity to our own venom would destabilize the power balance we have maintained for millennia. You are valuable because you are rare, not because we want more like you. The honesty was brutal, but Alara appreciated it more than false comfort. They were interrupted by a guard who entered and whispered urgently to Kalen. The king's face went carefully blank, and he dismissed Seraphine with a gesture. News from the border, he said to Alara. Human radicals attacked a vampire emissary in Millhaven. 2 of our people are dead. The council will demand retaliation. Alara felt ice spread through her stomach. What will you do? Buy time, he said. Use the promise of our wedding to argue for restraint. But my leverage grows thinner with each attack. The next morning, Alara woke early and found herself drawn to the Hall of Echoes by curiosity and restlessness. She discovered a gallery overlooking the council chamber, a narrow balcony hidden behind carved screens where she could watch and listen without being seen. The 12 council members had gathered in their circle of thrones, and the debate was already heated. Lord Theron stood at his obsidian throne, his voice ringing through the hall. This human theater will not save us, he declared. Every day we wait, they grow bolder. We should take the border towns by force, remind them why they fear us. Kalen sat on his throne of white marble, perfectly still. And prove we are the monsters they claim, he countered. The treaty holds if we show restraint. One more attack, another council member said, a thin vampire with nervous hands. One more provocation, and even the moderates will demand war. Then we prevent the next attack, Kalen said. We increase patrols. We negotiate with human leadership. We demonstrate that peace serves both our interests. You mean you parade your pet human and hope it impresses them? Theron spat. This marriage is a farce. You know it, I know it. The humans know it. It will fail and thousands will die because you were too weak to act. Alara gripped the balcony railing, her knuckles white. The debate continued for another hour before the council dispersed without reaching consensus. She returned to her tower room shaken and found Rowan standing outside her door as always. The young vampire had proven kind over the past 2 days, always courteous, sometimes even friendly. That evening he knocked softly before entering with her dinner tray. Behind him came Lydia, a vampire servant who had brought Alara fresh linens the day before, smiling and chatting about the palace gardens. Lydia set a crystal decanter of wine on the table and poured a glass with steady hands. Rowan froze. His nostrils flared and he moved with vampire speed, snatching the glass from Alara's hand before she could drink. He pulled a cage from beneath the sideboard. a cage containing a rat used for testing food safety, and poured drops of the wine into the creature's water dish. The rat drank and within seconds began convulsing, blood leaking from its eyes and mouth before it collapsed dead. Lydia ran. She made it 3 steps before Rowan tackled her, shouting for guards. Within minutes, the Rose Tower was filled with vampires, and Lydia was dragged before Kaelin in chains. Under interrogation, she broke quickly, confessing through tears that Lord Theron had promised her family lands and titles if she eliminated the human distraction. Kaelin's fury was terrible to witness. He summoned the full council to the Hall of Echoes within the hour, and Alara watched from her hidden gallery as he confronted Theron before the assembled vampires. "You ordered her death," Kaelin said, his voice like stone grinding. "You violated guest law, treaty law, and my direct command." Theron did not deny it. "She is a distraction," he said coldly. "A weakness you cannot afford. I acted to protect the kingdom from your sentimentality." Kaelin invoked an ancient rite, something Seraphine later explained was called the Rite of Challenge, a formal rebuke that marked a council member as suspect and stripped certain protections. "Harm her again," Kaelin said, and each word fell like a hammer blow, "and I will invoke blood treason. Even for you, even for a council member, that means execution." Theron's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing, simply turned and left the hall with his supporters trailing behind. The chamber emptied slowly, and Alara descended from the gallery to find Kaelin sitting alone on his throne, head in his hands. She approached quietly, and he looked up, exhaustion written in every line of his face. "I am sorry," he said. "I promised you protection, and failed." "You saved my life," Alara corrected. "Or rather, Rowan did. This is not failure. This is proof that you were right to be cautious." Something had shifted in her during the long night of watching the council debate and surviving assassination. She was not just a pawn in their game. She was a target, a symbol, a catalyst for change or destruction. Staying meant danger, but leaving meant war would come anyway, meant Theron and his faction would win, meant all the people in the border villages would die for lack of the fragile hope she represented. She sat on the throne next to Kaelin's, ignoring centuries of protocol that said humans did not sit on council seats. "I have questions," she said. "Hard questions." "Ask," he said. "What are the exact terms of the blood-binding ceremony? Can I negotiate protections for human villages into the marriage contract? Can I maintain contact with the human world, or am I expected to disappear into your court forever? What happens if you break your word to me? Do I have any real power, or am I just decorative?" Kaelin listened to each question and then stood, gesturing for her to follow. He led her to his private study and spent the next 3 hours drafting a document unprecedented in vampire history. A written marriage contract that spelled out terms and protections in explicit detail. "If you marry me," he said as he wrote, "you receive co-rule authority with equal voice in governance. You may choose your own personal guard from any vampire or human you trust. You gain veto power over council votes regarding war or military action against human settlements. The protection of Ashford and all surrounding villages within 50 miles will be written into law, enforceable by the full power of the Crown. And if I break these terms, you have the right to leave with your life guaranteed and compensation sufficient to live independently anywhere you choose." He signed it and sealed it with his blood, then handed it to her. "This is more power than any human has held in vampire territory in 1,000 years. I am trusting you with it because I believe you will use it wisely." Alara stared at the document, at the elegant script and the crimson seal, and felt the weight of decision pressing on her shoulders. She did not agree to marriage, not yet, but she agreed to the next step. "If I am going to be queen," she said carefully, "they need to see I am not afraid of them. I will meet the council formally. Let them see what they are getting." Kaelin's expression shifted, something like hope flickering in his crimson eyes. The formal presentation was scheduled for the following evening, and Seraphine and Lady Morgana spent the day preparing Alara like she was a weapon being sharpened for battle. They chose a gown of midnight blue velvet with silver embroidery that echoed the moon and thorn crest, designed to suggest vampire regalia while maintaining human dignity. Her white hair was styled in an intricate crown braid woven with silver thread. Lady Morgana painted her lips the color of wine and lined her violet eyes with kohl. When Alara looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look like a queen," Seraphine said with satisfaction. "Now you must speak like one." The Hall of Echoes was filled with vampires when they entered, the 12 council members on their thrones and dozens more standing in the galleries. Kaelin led Alara to the center of the chamber where a circular platform stood beneath the dome. The acoustics caught every breath, every whisper, amplifying them until the room felt alive with judgment. Kaelin presented her formally, his voice carrying to every corner. "Members of the council," he said. "I present Alara of Ashford, candidate for the blood-binding and potential queen of the Northern Territories. By ancient law, she has the right to address this council and state her intentions." Alara stepped forward and the room fell silent. She was required to speak, to state her name and lineage and purpose, and she did so without letting her voice tremble. "I am Alara, daughter of Marcus and Irina of Ashford," she said. "I have no titles, no noble blood, no claim to power beyond what biology and circumstance have given me. I am here because I was sold like livestock by a father who saw me as cursed. I am here because I am albino, and therefore immune to venom that would kill others. I am here because a vampire king purchased me from an auction block and offered me a choice between freedom and responsibility." She paused and added a line she had not planned, words that came from some deep place of certainty. "I am not here because I am powerless. I am here because I choose to consider a future where humans and vampires do not slaughter each other over old hatreds and ancient fears." The council murmured, and Alara saw approval on some faces, contempt on others. Lord Theron rose from his throne. "Eloquent words," he said with cold mockery. "But words are wind. You claim immunity, but we have only seen parlor tricks. Let the king bite you properly. If you survive, you are worthy. If not, the gods have decided, and we are spared this charade." Kaelin moved to refuse, but Alara spoke first. "Do it," she said, and her voice rang clear through the hall. "Let us remove all doubt." She walked to Kaelin and extended her wrist, meeting his eyes. The crimson gaze searched hers, and she nodded fractionally. He took her wrist in cool fingers and bit, his fangs sinking deep into the tender flesh of her inner arm. Pain blazed white-hot, and Alara gasped but did not cry out. She felt venom flood her veins, cold and invasive, racing through her bloodstream like ice water. Then came the silver shimmer, that familiar glow spreading from the bite mark, and beneath it she felt something else. Connection. For 30 seconds she was inside Kaelin's mind, or he was inside hers, the boundaries between them dissolving. She felt centuries of loneliness, an ache so profound it had become part of his identity. She felt exhaustion that went deeper than bone, the weight of governing and making impossible choices and being responsible for thousands of lives. She felt duty like iron chains that he had worn so long he barely noticed them anymore. And beneath it all, she felt hope, fragile and terrifying. The hope that perhaps this might work, that perhaps he would not have to be alone anymore, that perhaps peace was not just a beautiful dream, but an achievable reality. Then it ended, and she was herself again, gasping and shaking. The bite mark on her wrist was already healing, skin knitting together as the venom was absorbed and neutralized. The silver glow faded slowly, and the council chamber erupted in whispers. Theron's face had gone dark with fury, but he said nothing, simply sat back on his throne with his jaw clenched. Kaelin released her wrist and steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I understand now," she said, too low for anyone else to hear. I felt what you feel. I know what this costs you. His expression flickered, surprise and something deeper. They left the Hall of Echoes together, and Alara was still shaking from the intensity of the empathic link. She had known Kaelin was lonely, but feeling it firsthand, experiencing 3 centuries of isolation compressed into 30 seconds, had shaken her to her core. They had nearly reached the Rose Tower when a messenger arrived, a human courier bearing a sealed letter from the human capital. Kaelin read it, and his face went carefully blank. He handed it to Alara without comment. Her father Marcus had been arrested for selling a citizen to vampires, a capital crime under human law. The trial had been swift and the verdict unanimous. His execution was scheduled in 48 hours. The letter asked for confirmation that the transaction had indeed occurred and whether the vampire court would contest the human judgment. Alara stared at the words until they blurred. Her father, the man who had sold her, who had counted coins while she was dragged away in chains, who had celebrated her absence in a tavern. The man who had once been her mother's husband and had let grief turn him into something cruel. He was going to hang unless she intervened. She had the power now, or would have it if she completed the marriage. Kaelin could demand Marcus's release as part of treaty negotiations. One word from her and the man who betrayed her would live. The choice should have been easy. Let him die. Let justice take its course. He deserved no mercy from her. But she kept thinking about her mother's voice saying that mercy was what separated them from monsters. She kept thinking about Lady Morgana's words, that some choices defined you for centuries. She looked at Kaelin and saw understanding in his eyes. "This is your decision," he said quietly. "I will support whatever you choose." The hourglass in her tower room showed less than 40 hours remaining until her own deadline, and now she had a second countdown. 2 impossible choices that would define not just her future, but the kind of person she would become. Alara spent the night staring at the letter announcing her father's execution, the parchment crumpling in her hands as she read and reread the cold, legal language describing his crimes. Marcus of Ashford had violated the Citizen Protection Act of 1821 by selling his daughter to non-human entities for personal profit, and the penalty under human law was death by hanging. The execution would be public, a demonstration that the human government would not tolerate collaboration with vampires even in these fragile times of treaty negotiations. She should want him dead. Every rational part of her mind insisted that justice demanded his death, that the man who had sold her like livestock deserved no mercy from the daughter he had betrayed. But watching him die would make her complicit in a way that felt worse than the original betrayal, as if she was becoming the kind of person who measured worth in vengeance rather than principle. Kaelin found her on the tower balcony at dawn, still holding the letter, her eyes dry but red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He stood beside her without speaking for a long moment, simply present in a way that felt more comforting than any words could be. "I can intervene," he said finally. "As part of treaty negotiations, I can demand his release to vampire custody. The Human Council will not want to refuse and risk damaging the peace process. But it will cost political capital, and some will see it as you using your position for personal gain. It will make you look weak." "I know," Alara said quietly, "and I still cannot decide if that matters more than letting him hang." Kieran appeared in the tower room later that morning with his characteristic dramatic timing, sprawling in one of the silk chairs with calculated casualness. He had brought wine and poured 2 glasses without asking, handing one to Alara with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Let him hang," he said bluntly. "You will be free of him, and no one will blame you for refusing to save a man who sold you. Mercy is overrated, especially when extended to those who showed you none. The human authorities want to make an example of him anyway. Why stand in their way?" Alara sipped the wine and felt its warmth spread through her chest. "Because it makes me like him," she said. Because choosing who deserves to live based on whether they hurt me is exactly what he did to me. He decided I had no value, so he sold me. If I decide he has no value, so I let him die, I am using the same logic. Kieran studied her with genuine curiosity. You are far more interesting than I expected, he said. My brother chose well even if he chose for the wrong reasons. But do not mistake mercy for strength. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let natural consequences unfold. Lady Morgana came to the Rose Tower that afternoon and dismissed Kieran with a gesture that suggested centuries of authority. The elder vampire settled into the chair he had vacated and regarded Alara with those smoke-colored eyes that seemed to see past flesh into intention. You are struggling with your father's fate, she said, not a question, but a statement. I want to tell you a story, if you will hear it. Alara nodded, and Morgana's gaze turned distant with memory. 300 years ago, I loved a human man, she said. A scholar who studied our kind with fascination rather than fear. We were lovers for 5 mortal years, and I planned to turn him, to give him eternity at my side. But he betrayed me. Sold information about our weaknesses to vampire hunters. 12 of my people died in the attack that followed. When he was captured and brought before me in chains, I had every right to execute him. The law demanded it. Justice demanded it. My grief demanded it. What did you do? Alara asked. I spared him, Morgana said. Not because he deserved mercy, but because I needed to know if I was capable of it. I sent him into exile with his life intact and instructions never to return. He lived another 40 years, and I am told he spent them working to prevent the very violence he had once enabled. That act of mercy defined me for 3 centuries. It reminded me in every difficult moment afterward that power is not choosing who lives. Power is choosing why they live. Alara felt something settle in her chest, a clarity that had been missing before. She found Kalen in his study reviewing Border Patrol reports and interrupted without apology. I want you to intervene, she said. But not for a simple release. I want terms. Marcus must publicly apologize for what he did, acknowledge that he was wrong to sell me, and accept exile to a labor colony where he will work to make restitution. I want accountability, not blood. I want him to live with what he did, rather than escape it through death. Kalen set down his reports and studied her face. That is a harder punishment than execution, he observed. You know that. I know, Alara said, but it is the right one. He will have to face every day knowing his daughter had the power to let him die and chose otherwise. Maybe that will change him, maybe it will not. Either way, I will know I acted from principle rather than pain. Kalen drafted the treaty addendum himself, writing in his precise, elegant hand. He summoned his fastest emissary and sent the vampire riding south before sunset with instructions to deliver the proposal directly to the Human Council. The message was clear and diplomatic, but left no room for negotiation. Marcus would be released to vampire custody for rehabilitation and restitution work. He would serve a term of labor in vampire territory, providing service to the very people he had sought to profit from. Refusal would be taken as a sign that the human government valued symbolic execution over practical justice and would damage treaty negotiations. The Human Council deliberated for 6 hours before sending their response. They agreed reluctantly, not wanting to appear weak but less willing to risk war over one condemned man. Marcus would be transported to Nighthaven under guard within 2 days. When he arrived, it was in chains again, though these were lighter than the ones Alara had worn on the auction block. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt and unshaven, his eyes darting with the fear of a man who had expected death and received something far more uncertain. The guards brought him to a holding cell in the lower levels of the palace, and Alara went to face him alone, despite Rowan's protests. The cell was clean but spare. Stone walls and a simple cot, barred windows that looked out on nothing. Marcus stood when she entered, and for a moment neither spoke. You, he said finally, his voice rough. You did this. You saved me. Why? Elara looked at the man who had given her life and then sold it away, trying to find some remnant of the father she remembered from early childhood. She found only a stranger worn down by grief and poor choices. Not for you, she said quietly. For the person I want to be. You sold me because you saw me as worthless, as a burden to be discarded. If I let you die, I would be doing the same thing, deciding your worth based on whether you served my needs. I refuse to become that. Marcus stared at her, and something crumpled in his expression. I am sorry, he said, and the words sounded like they were being dragged from somewhere deep and painful. Your mother would be ashamed of what I did. I am ashamed of what I did. I was drowning in grief and debt, and I took the easy path. I told myself you would be better off anywhere else, but I knew that was a lie. I knew it when I took the money, and I knew it when I watched them take you away. Elara felt tears prick her eyes, but did not let them fall. You will work here, she said. You will serve the vampire community, help maintain the palace grounds, assist with whatever labor they require. You will do this for 5 years, and at the end you will be released with enough money to start again somewhere far from Ashford. You will never contact me again unless I reach out first. Do you understand? He nodded, unable to speak. This is more mercy than I deserve, he managed. I know, Elara said. That is the point. She turned to leave and paused at the cell door. My mother taught me that we are defined by how we treat those who have wronged us. I am choosing to honor her memory by being better than my worst impulses. I hope you will do the same. Kaelin had watched the confrontation from the corridor, staying out of sight but close enough to intervene if needed. When Elara emerged, he fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence until they reached the sunken gardens. He will resent you, Kaelin said quietly, for making him live with his shame instead of escaping it. Perhaps, Elara agreed, but he will live, and maybe, eventually, he will understand why that matters. Seraphine found them there among the glowing flowers, and Kaelin told her what Elara had chosen to do. The advisor listened with her usual impassive expression and then said something Elara did not expect. She will be a better queen than you are a king, Seraphine said to Kaelin. She already understands what you have taken centuries to learn. That power wielded with mercy is far more dangerous to your enemies than power wielded with cruelty. The hourglass in Elara's tower showed 24 hours remaining when she returned to her quarters that evening. She had negotiated protections for human villages, survived an assassination attempt, proven herself to the council, and resolved the painful question of her father's fate. Every obstacle had been cleared, every concern addressed. The only question remaining was whether she wanted this, whether she was willing to bind herself to Kaelin and the future they might build together. She found a note waiting on her writing desk, sealed with black wax. The roof at midnight, it read in Kaelin's elegant script. There are things I need to say before your time runs out. Elara climbed the spiral stairs to the palace roof as the clock tower chimed midnight, emerging onto a flat expanse of stone surrounded by parapets. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Kaelin stood at the edge looking out over the Shadowvale forest, and he turned when he heard her approach. Thank you for coming, he said. I was not certain you would. You asked, Elara said simply. That seems to matter. He gestured for her to join him at the parapet, and they stood side by side looking at the dark landscape spread below. I need to be honest with you, he said after a moment. When this began, it was entirely political. I needed a human bride to satisfy the council, and you were the only viable candidate. I did not expect to care whether you stayed beyond the treaty requirements, but I do care. Not as a king needing a treaty, as someone who has not felt hope in a century and suddenly does not want to lose it. Elara felt her breath catch. The empathic link during the bite had shown her his loneliness, but hearing him admit to feeling hope because of her was different, more vulnerable. I felt what you feel, she said quietly. When you bit me in the Hall of Echoes, for those 30 seconds I was inside your mind. Centuries of isolation, of being responsible for everything, of never being able to let anyone close because closeness was a liability. I recognized it because I have felt it too. I have been alone my whole life, feared and isolated for being different. Maybe that is why this terrifies me so much. Because I want it to work, and wanting things has only ever led to disappointment. Kalen turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight his white hair seemed to glow. I cannot promise you easy happiness, he said. I cannot promise that being queen will be anything other than difficult and dangerous. But I can promise partnership. I can promise that you will not face those difficulties alone. I can promise to listen when you speak and value your judgment even when it contradicts mine. I can promise to protect you with everything I have and build the future we both want, even if it takes decades to achieve. Ilara met his crimson gaze and saw sincerity there, saw the hope he had mentioned and the fear beneath it. Seraphine found us the next morning and brought her to Kalen's study, where the vampire advisor laid out the full details of the blood-binding ritual with clinical precision. The ceremony would take place before the full council, she explained. Ilara and Kalen would exchange vows of partnership and mutual protection. Then Kalen would bite her throat. Not the wrist, but the throat where the major artery pulsed close to the surface, and the bite would be deep and intimate. He would inject venom directly into her bloodstream, and she would feel the connection forming. Immediately after, she would drink 3 drops of his blood from a ceremonial vessel. The combination of venom and blood would create a permanent magical bond, a connection that would allow them to sense each other's location and strong emotions at all times. She would gain extended lifespan, aging 1 year for every 10 vampire years, but would remain fundamentally human. The bond could only be broken by death. Ilara listened to every detail and then asked the question that had been forming in her mind. Is the bond equal, she asked, or is one partner dominant? Seraphine hesitated. Traditionally, the vampire is dominant, she admitted. The bond allows them to sense the human more strongly than the reverse, to exert a certain degree of influence. It is a protection mechanism, ensuring that the human partner cannot easily betray vampire secrets. Ilara shook her head. That is not acceptable, she said firmly. If we are truly partners, then the bond must be equal. I want the same ability to sense if Kalen is in danger or lying. I want the connection to flow both ways with equal strength. Otherwise, this is just a pretty collar replacing the iron one my father put on me. Kalen had been silent during Seraphine's explanation, but now he spoke. Done, he said. We will modify the ritual to create an equal bond. It has never been done before, but that does not mean it cannot be. Seraphine, draft the changes and consult the blood archives for precedent. If there is none, we will create it. The advisor looked between them with something like approval. As you wish, she said. I will have the modifications ready by sunset. When they were alone again, Kalen crossed to where Ilara stood and did something that shocked her to her core. He knelt, dropping to one knee before her with his head bowed. Vampire kings did not kneel to anyone, certainly not to humans, but here he was on the stone floor of his study, looking up at her with absolute sincerity. He produced a ring from his pocket, a simple silver band set with a moonstone that caught the light and glowed softly. Will you be my queen? He asked. My partner and my conscience. Will you bind yourself to me, not because you have no choice, but because you choose the future we could build together? Will you take this risk with me and help me prove that peace is not just a beautiful dream, but something we can make real? Ilara looked down at him, at this ancient, powerful being humbling himself before her, and felt something break open in her chest. Yes, she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. But not because I have no choice. Because I am choosing this. Because I am choosing you, and the possibility of what we might become together. Because I have been powerless my entire life, and you are offering me real power. the power to change things and build something better. Yes. Kaylin slipped the ring onto her finger and rose, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place she had never been. They stood together in the study, holding each other, while the candles burned low and the hourglass in her tower ran out its final grains of sand. For the first time since being dragged onto that auction platform, Alara felt not like property or a political pawn, but like a person making a choice that mattered, a choice that would define not just her future, but the futures of thousands who would never know her name. Then the explosion came. The sound was massive, a concussion that shook the palace foundations and sent books tumbling from shelves. Kaylin released her instantly, moving to the window to see the north wing engulfed in flames. Screams echoed through the corridors and the smell of smoke began filtering through the study door. Guards burst in shouting about attack and treachery, about fires set in multiple locations and the north wing collapsing. Alara saw Kaylin's expression harden into something cold and lethal, saw the king replace the man she had been holding moments before. "Theron," he said, and it was not a question. "Lock down the palace, find him and bring him to the Hall of Echoes in chains. This ends tonight." Rowan appeared in the doorway, his young face set with determination. "My king," he said. "Lord Theron has barricaded himself in the council chamber with his supporters. They are calling for your abdication and the dissolution of the treaty. They have hostages." Kaylin looked at Alara, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was her last chance to run, to take the ring off and claim the freedom she had been promised and disappear before the palace tore itself apart. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it tight. "We face this together," she said. "That is what partners do." They ran toward the flames and the screaming and whatever waited in the Hall of Echoes, and Alara felt the weight of the moonstone ring on her finger like a promise she intended to keep no matter what it cost. The corridor filled with smoke as Alara and Kaylin ran toward the Hall of Echoes, guards materializing around them from side passages with weapons drawn and faces grim. The north wing was engulfed in flames that painted the stone walls orange and gold, and through the windows Alara could see vampires fighting in the courtyards below. Theron had not acted alone. This was coordinated, planned, a coup attempt that had been months in the making. Rowan intercepted them at the junction near the council chamber, his face streaked with soot and blood. "My king," he gasped. "Lord Theron has barricaded the Hall of Echoes with at least 20 supporters. They have declared you unfit to rule and demand your abdication. They have taken hostages from the moderate faction and sealed the exits. Their goal is to kill the human girl and frame it as sabotage from radical human elements, giving them justification to dissolve the treaty and launch full war." Kaylin's expression went cold and terrible. "Get her out," he ordered Rowan. "Take the servant passages to the stables and ride south. Do not stop until you reach human territory." Alara pulled free of the guard's grip. "No," she said flatly. "We are partners, or we are nothing. You do not get to send me away the moment things become dangerous. That is not how this works." Kaylin turned to her and she saw fear in his crimson eyes, raw and undisguised. "They will kill you," he said. "That is their entire strategy. Without you, the marriage fails and the treaty collapses. I cannot let that happen." "Then we fight together," Alara said. "You told me I would have real power. You told me we would face difficulties as partners. Were those just pretty words or did you mean them?" Their eyes locked and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than strategy. Kaylin nodded once and handed her a dagger from his belt, silver with a moonstone in the pommel. "Stay close to me," he said. "Do exactly as I say. If I tell you to run, you run." "Understood." "Understood," Alara lied, knowing she would do no such thing. They advanced on the Hall of Echoes with a force of 12 loyal guards, Rowan and Kieran among them. The younger brother had appeared from somewhere with his sword already bloody and a grin that looked half mad. "About time we had some excitement. Kieran said. I was getting bored with all this peace and diplomacy nonsense. The doors to the hall were barred from inside, but Kaelin's guards broke them down with coordinated strikes, wood splintering and hinges shrieking. They poured into the circular chamber to find chaos. Theron stood at the center with his supporters arrayed around him, perhaps 20 vampires armed with silver weapons and expressions of zealous conviction. 4 moderate council members were chained to their thrones, including Lady Morgana, who met Alara's eyes across the chamber with a look that said, "Endure." The battle began instantly, vampires colliding with supernatural speed and strength that made the air itself seem to shatter. Alara saw Kaelin move like liquid shadow, his blade finding throats and hearts with centuries of practiced precision. Kieran fought beside him with reckless abandon, laughing as he parried and struck. The guards formed a protective circle, but it fractured quickly under the assault, vampires scattering to individual duels that ranged across the hall. Alara crouched behind one of the stone thrones, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She was not a fighter, had never held a weapon in her life before tonight, but she gripped the silver dagger Kaelin had given her and tried to think. She was small, easily overlooked in the chaos, and she could use that. A vampire broke through the defensive line and came for her, fangs bared and eyes wild with bloodlust. Alara threw herself sideways and the creature stumbled past, giving her an opening. She drove the dagger into its back more from instinct than skill, felt the blade sink deep between ribs. The vampire screamed and dissolved into ash, and Alara stared at her hands in shock. She had killed something. The knowledge felt surreal and terrible. Across the chamber she saw Kieran grappling with 2 attackers at once, his sword knocked away, and one of them raising a wooden stake. Alara moved without thinking, using her small size to slip through the fighting, and grabbed a fallen silver dagger from the floor. She ran at the vampire threatening Kieran and stabbed upward into its spine, putting all her weight behind the blow. The creature arched and fell, giving Kieran the opening he needed to snap the second attacker's neck. He looked at her with genuine surprise. "You just saved my life," he said. "I know," Alara gasped. "Do not make me regret it." Theron had been watching from the center of the chamber, directing his forces like a general, but now he moved with terrifying speed. He broke through Kaelin's guard and drove the king backward, pursuing him toward the archway that led to the blood archives. Alara followed, her instincts screaming danger, and arrived in time to see Theron corner Kaelin among the glass cases of ancient treaties. The elder vampire moved like a serpent, his blade opening a deep gash across Kaelin's ribs. Blood bloomed crimson against black fabric, and Kaelin staggered, wounded but not beaten. Theron smiled without warmth. "This ends now," he said. "Your weakness ends now. The girl dies, you die, and I lead our people back to their proper place. Humans are prey, not partners. This treaty is suicide dressed up as diplomacy. When you are dead, I will reclaim our dominance and show the humans what it means to fear the night again." Kaelin pressed one hand to his bleeding side, but his voice was steady. "You have already lost," he said. "She has proven humans are equals, proven it to the council and to anyone willing to see. Kill her, and the moderates will turn on you. Kill me, and you fracture the very power structure you claim to protect. You are not saving our people, Theron. You are destroying them out of pride and fear." For a moment something flickered in Theron's ancient eyes, doubt or recognition, but it vanished behind renewed fury. Better destruction than submission. He snarled and lunged. Alara saw Kaelin's strength failing, saw the blood loss taking its toll, and made a desperate calculation. Near the entrance to the archives hung an ornate bell, bronze and ancient, covered in runes that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. Seraphine had mentioned it once in passing, the emergency ritual bell that could summon all council members under penalty of death for ignoring its call. It had not been rung in 3 centuries. Alara ran for it while Theron was focused on Kaelin, grabbed the rope and pulled with all her strength. The sound that erupted was not music, but command, a tone that resonated in bone and blood and made every vampire in the palace freeze. The note hung in the air, vibrating through stone and flesh, impossible to ignore. Fighting stopped. Attackers and defenders alike turned toward the source of the sound, compelled by magic older than any of them. The council members began arriving within minutes, even those who had been chained to their thrones somehow freed by the bell's authority. They materialized from corridors and chambers, their faces showing confusion and anger and fear. Lady Morgana arrived first, her chains broken, and took in the scene with sharp assessment. Even Theron's allies came, drawn by compulsion they could not resist. Ancient law was absolute. When the emergency bell rang, all council members must attend or face final death. The chamber filled with vampires, moderate and radical alike, and they formed a circle around Theron and Kaelin and Alara. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Theron had relied on having superior numbers in a contained space, but now the full council stood witness. Lady Morgana stepped forward and her voice carried absolute authority. Lord Theron, you stand accused of attacking the sovereign, of taking council members hostage, and of attempting to murder a guest under protection of ancient law. These are the definitions of blood treason. What say you? Theron looked around at the assembled council and seemed to realize his mistake. 4 other moderates moved to stand beside Morgana, forming a clear faction. The coup had collapsed the moment the bell rang, its success dependent on secrecy and speed that were no longer possible. He lowered his weapon and straightened, attempting dignity. I say that I acted to protect our people from a king who has forgotten what we are, he said. But his voice lacked conviction now, the fire gone from it. Guards seized him and forced him to his knees. Kaelin, still bleeding from the gash in his ribs, approached slowly. You will face trial under full council law, he said. Until then you are confined to the deepest cells. Take him. They dragged Theron away, and the elder vampire did not resist, only watched Alara with eyes that promised this was not finished. The Hall of Echoes emptied slowly as guards rounded up the remaining conspirators and healers tended to the wounded. 14 vampires lay dead, their bodies already beginning to decay into ash. 31 more were injured with varying severity. Alara noted with bitter irony that not a single human had been harmed. The violence had been entirely internal, vampires killing vampires over the question of whether peace was possible. The formal trial convened 2 days later after the fires had been extinguished and the palace secured. The full council assembled in their circular thrones with Kaelin presiding from his seat of white marble. Theron was brought in chains, stripped of his formal robes and wearing only simple black. The charges were read aloud by Seraphine, her voice echoing through the chamber. Blood treason, attacking the sovereign, kidnapping council members, and attempted murder of a protected guest. Each charge carried the penalty of final death, the complete destruction of a vampire through stake, beheading, and burning. Theron was given opportunity to defend himself, and he spoke for nearly an hour, outlining his belief that the treaty was a fatal mistake, that vampires were meant to rule through strength rather than negotiate through compromise. He was eloquent and passionate and utterly convinced of his righteousness. When he finished, the council deliberated for 3 hours. Alara watched from the gallery, her body aching from injuries sustained in the fighting, her mind exhausted from 2 days of minimal sleep. The vote came back 11-1 for execution. Only one council member, an ancient vampire who had fought in wars centuries past, voted for exile instead. Kaelin rose to pronounce sentence, and Alara felt something twist in her chest. This was justice, but it was also death, sanctioned and formal. Before he could speak, she descended from the gallery, ignoring protocol and the gasps of assembled vampires. She walked to the center of the chamber and addressed the council directly. I ask for mercy, she said, and her voice carried clearly despite her exhaustion. Not because Lord Theron deserves it, but because how we begin this reign will define everything that follows. If we start with an execution, we prove the radicals right. We prove that power is only maintained through violence. Exile him instead. Strip him of titles and lands, brand him with the traitor's mark, and send him to the northern wastes where survival is uncertain and return is impossible. Let history forget him rather than make him a martyr. The council erupted in argument. Some called her soft, others naive. But Kalen raised his hand for silence and the chamber stilled. The human speaks wisdom, he said. Mercy is harder than vengeance and far more powerful. I support her judgment. We will exile Lord Theron to the wastes under terms that ensure he can never return or threaten our people again. Several council members looked displeased, but none outright objected. Theron was sentenced to exile, the pronouncement formal and binding. Guards dragged him to the branding chamber where a red-hot iron marked his forehead with the symbol for traitor, a permanent scar that would identify him to any vampire he encountered. He screamed during the branding, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. When they brought him back for final banishment, he looked at Alara with undisguised hatred. "You think mercy makes you strong?" he snarled as they dragged him toward the doors. "It will get you killed. Mark my words, girl. Your softness will be the death of you and everyone you claim to protect." Then he was gone, taken north toward the uninhabitable wastes, where temperatures dropped below freezing and nothing grew. Alara watched him disappear and felt no satisfaction, only a bone-deep weariness that came from making impossible choices. The palace began repairs immediately. Masons worked around the clock to rebuild the north wing. Healers tended the injured with vampire efficiency. The dead were honored in a ceremony that Alara attended, standing beside Kalen as they lit pyres for those who had fallen. 14 lives lost over politics and pride, over a vision of the future that could not accommodate change. She spoke their names aloud as tradition required, honoring even those who had stood with Theron because death erased faction. Afterward, she returned to the Rose Tower and collapsed. She had not slept properly in 36 hours, had not eaten more than fragments, had fought and killed and made decisions that would haunt her. Kalen found her there, still in her blood-stained gown, staring at nothing. He sent the servants away and tended her himself, bringing warm water and clean cloths. He cleaned the scrapes on her palms where she had fallen during the fighting, wrapped her bruised shoulder with gentle competence. His own wound had been healed by vampire magic, but she could see the fatigue in his face, the cost of the past days written in the lines around his eyes. "You should rest," she said as he worked. "You are as exhausted as I am." "I will rest when you do," he replied. Their intimacy deepened in that moment, not sexual, but profoundly tender. He brushed her white hair back from her face with careful fingers, and she leaned into the touch like a flower turning toward sun. They lay down together on the silk sheets, still clothed, and she fell asleep holding his hand. She dreamed of fire and blood, and a future that felt suddenly possible despite everything trying to destroy it. 1 week passed in a blur of preparation and negotiation. The council formally approved the marriage with 8 votes in favor, 3 abstaining, and 1 vacant seat where Theron had sat. Human delegates began arriving from across the territories, diplomats and observers sent to witness this unprecedented union. Vampire dignitaries came as well, some curious, others skeptical, all aware that what happened in Nighthaven would determine the future of their people. The wedding would be broadcast magically through enchanted mirrors placed in town squares across both human and vampire lands. Millions would watch. Lady Morgana took charge of Alara's education, teaching her vampire court etiquette with patient precision. How to greet elder vampires without giving offense, which topics were acceptable in formal conversation and which were forbidden, the intricate hierarchy of the council and how to navigate it without appearing weak. Alara absorbed it all, her mind sharp despite her exhaustion. Seraphine handled the ritual training, walking Alara through every step of the blood-binding ceremony. The bite would hurt, she explained bluntly. Kalen would sink his fangs into her throat and inject venom directly into the major artery. The pain would be intense but brief. The blood exchange would feel like ice and fire simultaneously, her body temperature dropping while her blood burned. The bond would form in stages, first physical, then emotional, then permanent. Once complete, it could never be broken except by death. Alara designed her own wedding gown with input from vampire and human seamstresses, creating something that symbolized the union she was entering. White silk formed the foundation, representing her humanity and the traditional color for human brides. Black lace overlaid it in intricate patterns of moons and thorns. The vampire royal crest worked into the fabric itself. The dress was beautiful and strange, neither fully human nor vampire, but something new. Her hair would remain unbound, a human tradition for brides that she insisted on maintaining. Kalen wrote his vows himself and shared a draft with her 3 days before the ceremony, sitting together in the library where they had first really talked. She read the elegant script and felt tears blur the words. He promised partnership without possession, protection without domination, a future built on mutual respect rather than ancient hierarchies. He promised to listen when she spoke, to value her judgment even when it challenged his own, to build peace, not through force, but through the patient work of proving it possible. The vows were beautiful and terrifying in their sincerity. "I cannot promise you easy happiness," they concluded, "but I promise you will never face difficulty alone." She cried reading them, pressing the parchment to her chest. "These are perfect," she whispered. "Do not change a single word." Kieran found her the evening before the wedding, pulling her aside with uncharacteristic seriousness. The younger vampire had been invaluable during the coup attempt, fighting with skill and courage, and Alara had developed a cautious fondness for him. He led her to a balcony overlooking the shadow veil and spoke quietly. "The ceremony will bond you forever," he said. "If he dies, you will feel his death like a wound in your own chest. If you die, it will break him in ways I am not certain he could survive." The bond is not just romantic symbolism, it is magic and biology intertwined. Are you ready for that weight? Alara looked out over the dark forest and thought about all the weights she had already carried, being called cursed, being sold like property, being thrust into politics and power she never asked for. "I have been a ghost my whole life," she said quietly. "Invisible, dismissed, treated like I did not matter. I am ready to be real, to matter to someone, and have them matter to me, whatever the cost." Kieran studied her face, and then nodded. "My brother is lucky," he said. "I hope he knows it." The human delegation from Ashford arrived on the final day before the wedding, a small group of Alara's former neighbors who came to witness what she had become. Some were supportive, reaching for her hands and congratulating her with genuine warmth. Others whispered behind their hands that she was a traitor, a collaborator who had sold out her own kind. Alara held her head high and greeted them all with courtesy she did not feel. Then Helena appeared, her mother's oldest friend, a woman who had brought soup during Irina's final illness, and held Alara while she cried at the funeral. The older woman embraced her fiercely and whispered in her ear. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said. "Not for marrying a king, but for choosing courage over bitterness, for building instead of destroying. She sees you, child. I know she does." Alara clung to those words as the day faded toward evening. She returned to the Rose Tower to find an envelope slipped under her door, unmarked and sealed with red wax. She opened it with trembling fingers and read the message inside. "The ceremony will fail," it said in angular script. "Albino blood curdles the bond. You will both die on the altar." It was signed with a crimson handprint, still wet enough to smudge when she touched it. Alara stared at the letter, her heart pounding, and tried to decide if this was a real threat or a final attempt at psychological warfare. Tomorrow she would bind herself to Kaelin forever or die trying. Either way, there was no turning back now. Ilara found Kaelin in his study before dawn, the letter clutched in her trembling hand. He was reviewing security arrangements for the ceremony, maps and guard rotations spread across his desk, but he looked up the moment she entered and saw her face. The letter was thrust toward him without preamble, and he read it in silence, his expression darkening with each word. "A remnant of Theron's faction," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A final attempt to shake your resolve before the ceremony. They know they cannot stop the wedding through force, so they try fear instead." "But what if it is true?" Ilara whispered. "What if there is something about albino blood that no one knows, something that will kill you when we complete the bond? What if I am poison instead of cure?" Kaelin set the letter down and came around the desk to take her hands. His touch was cool but steady, anchoring her spiraling thoughts. "We will investigate," he said. "We will confirm with absolute certainty that this is a lie. Then you will decide whether to proceed based on truth rather than manufactured terror." Seraphine was summoned and arrived within minutes, still in her sleeping robes but alert. She examined the letter with clinical detachment, then disappeared into the blood archives for 3 hours. When she emerged, her expression was set with certainty. "There is no historical precedent for albinos curdling the blood bond," she reported. "I have searched every record going back 1,000 years. The claim is complete fabrication designed to create exactly the doubt you are experiencing." But the fear remained real despite the reassurance. Ilara could not shake the image of Kaelin dying on the altar, his body rejecting the bond because of something fundamental about her biology. She had been called cursed her entire life, and some deep part of her believed it, believed that everything she touched would eventually turn to ash. Kaelin seemed to sense her continuing anxiety because he took her hand and led her back to the blood archives personally. He guided her to a specific case near the back, one containing records so old the parchment had gone brown and brittle. "Look," he said, pointing to 3 separate documents. "This is Magistrate Valdrin, who bonded with an albino human woman named Esme in 1642. They ruled jointly for 43 years until her natural death. This is Lady Cassandra, who bonded with an albino scholar named Thomas in 1721. Their partnership lasted 61 years and produced significant advances in human-vampire cooperation. And this is Lord Mikhail, who bonded with an albino artisan named Lucia in 1798. She lived to be 94 years old, their bond never wavering." Ilara studied the records, tracing faded ink with careful fingers. The evidence was clear. Albinos had successfully bonded with vampires multiple times throughout history. She was not unique, and she was not poison. "You are not a curse," Kaelin said quietly. "You are the cure to centuries of isolation, proof that our peoples can truly merge. That letter is propaganda from those who fear change. Do not give them power over you." She nodded, but sleep did not come easily that night. The final rehearsal took place the next afternoon in the inner sanctum where the actual ceremony would be held. The space was circular and intimate, walls of polished obsidian that reflected candlelight in dancing patterns. Seraphine walked them through every step, correcting positioning and timing with exacting precision. The ritual wine sat in its ceremonial chalice on the central altar, deep red liquid that would be blessed before the blood exchange. Rowan was performing his usual security check when he noticed something wrong. The wine smelled off, a faint bitter undertone beneath the expected sweetness. He called for a testing kit immediately and ran the analysis while everyone watched in tense silence. The results came back within minutes. Nightshade extract, concentrated enough to kill a vampire within hours. Someone had replaced the ritual wine with poison. The guards swept through the palace with ruthless efficiency, interrogating servants and checking credentials. They found the infiltrator within an hour, a human servant named Peter who had worked in the kitchens for 6 months. Under interrogation, he broke quickly, confessing that he had been bribed by a human extremist cell operating in the border territories. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Poison Kalen during the ceremony, let him die in front of witnesses from both territories, then blame vampire infighting and use the chaos to restart the war. Alara was meant to survive as proof that vampires could not be trusted, that even their own king's wedding was sabotaged from within. The extremists believed she was a collaborator, a traitor to her own kind, and her survival would serve their narrative. "What do you want done with him?" Kalen asked Alara, and she understood this was a test of her judgment. She looked at Peter, young and terrified, probably barely 20 years old, and saw desperation rather than malice. "He will stand trial under human law," she said. "We will hand him to the human delegation and let them decide his fate. That proves we respect their justice system and shows we have nothing to hide." Security was heightened immediately. The wedding was moved deeper into the fortified inner sanctum, access restricted to verified loyalists only. Guest lists were reviewed 3 times. Every servant was interviewed. Guards tripled their patrols. Some of Kalen's advisors suggested postponing the ceremony, but Alara refused. "If we cancel, they win," she said firmly. "They prove that fear and violence can derail peace. We proceed as planned and show them that threats will not break our resolve." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, winter sun streaming through the palace windows in pale golden light. Alara woke alone in the Rose Tower, tradition dictating that bride and groom spend the night before separated. She bathed in water scented with night jasmine and let the servants dress her in the gown she had designed, white silk and black lace that felt like wearing symbolism. Her white hair was left unbound, flowing past her shoulders in waves that caught the light. Helena came to see her before the ceremony, bringing a ribbon that had belonged to Alara's mother. "Something old," the woman said, tying it around Alara's wrist. "Your mother wore this on her wedding day. Now you wear it on yours. She would want you to have it." Alara traced the faded blue fabric and felt tears threaten. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering her, for remembering me." The inner sanctum was lit by 1,000 candles when she entered, their flames creating a constellation of light against the black walls. 200 witnesses filled the space, vampire council members in their formal robes and human delegates in their finest clothing. Palace staff lined the walls, everyone who had worked to make this moment possible. The air smelled of candle wax in anticipation. Kalen waited at the center in formal black, with the silver crown of his office, and when he saw her, his expression shifted into something profound. Alara walked toward him without hesitation, each step feeling like a choice she was making consciously. This was not being dragged onto an auction block. This was walking toward a future she had negotiated and designed. They stood facing each other before the altar, and Seraphine began the ritual words, ancient phrases in a language older than either of their peoples. Then came the vows they had written themselves. Kalen spoke first, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the sanctum. "I promise partnership without possession," he said, "protection without domination, a future built on mutual respect rather than ancient hierarchies. I promise to listen when you speak, to value your judgment even when it challenges mine, to build peace not through force but through patient work. I cannot promise easy happiness, but I promise you will never face difficulty alone." Alara's voice was steadier than she expected when she responded. "I promise courage without recklessness," she said, "mercy without weakness, a future where being different is strength rather than curse. I promise to stand beside you in governance, to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable, to prove that humans and vampires can build something better than endless war. I cannot promise perfection, but I promise I will try every day to be worthy of this choice we are making." The witnesses were silent, the weight of the moment pressing on all of them. Then came the bite. Kalen stepped closer and cupped her face with cool hands. his crimson eyes searching hers one final time for certainty. She nodded and tilted her head, exposing the vulnerable curve of her throat. He bit deep, fangs sinking into the major artery, and pain blazed white and terrible. Alara gasped, but did not scream, her hands gripping his shoulders as venom flooded her bloodstream. It was cold, so cold, racing through her veins like liquid ice. Then came the silver shimmer, that familiar glow spreading from the bite mark, and beneath it, something else. Connection. She felt the bond forming in real time, a tether snapping into place between her heart and his. She could sense his presence like a second heartbeat, could feel his emotions bleeding into hers. Relief and hope, and something deeper, something that felt like love, though neither had named it yet. The crowd held its breath and watched as the silver light grew brighter, Alara's skin glowing with absorbed venom. She did not fall, did not die. Instead, she felt warmth spreading through her chest, the bond taking root. Kaylin released her throat and the bite mark began healing immediately. Skin knitting together as her unique biology processed the venom. Blood still trickled down her neck and Seraphine caught it in the ceremonial chalice, mixing it with 3 drops of Kaylin's blood drawn from a ritual cut on his palm. The advisor blessed the mixture with words of binding and handed the chalice to Alara. She drank. The taste was metal and winter, copper and ice combined. Her vision blurred and then cleared with supernatural sharpness, colors becoming more vivid and sounds more distinct. She could hear heartbeats throughout the chamber, could smell the fear and hope mixing in the air. Most profoundly, she could feel Kaylin's heartbeat as if it were her own, a steady rhythm that matched and merged with hers. The bond activated fully, and visible silver light erupted between them, 2 auras connecting and merging. The light was bright enough to illuminate the entire sanctum, casting dancing shadows on the obsidian walls. The witnesses gasped, and Lady Morgana whispered something that Alara barely heard. "I have never seen it so strong," the elder vampire said. "Never in 4 centuries." Seraphine raised her hands, and her voice rang with formal authority. "By the power of ancient law and witnessed bond, I declare you united. King and Queen of the Northern Territories, partners in governance and life. May your union bring the peace we all seek." The human delegates applauded cautiously, uncertain what they had just witnessed. The Vampire Council bowed in unison, a gesture of respect that acknowledged Alara's new status. Kaylin took her hand and she felt the bond pulse between them, warm and permanent. They were walking toward the sanctum exit when the explosion came. The sound was massive, a concussion that rattled the palace foundations and sent candles toppling. Screams erupted from the outer courtyard, and the smell of smoke filtered through the corridors. Guards burst in shouting about attack and fire, about human extremists launching a suicide assault. Alara and Kaylin ran together toward the chaos, the bond between them thrumming with shared urgency. The outer courtyard was engulfed in flames, carriages burning and delegates scattered in panic. 3 vampire dignitaries lay injured, their formal robes scorched and faces twisted in pain. 5 masked figures stood at the center of the destruction, human by their scent, each holding crude explosive devices that smoked and sparked. Guards had them surrounded, but no one moved, the standoff precarious. One of the masked figures saw Alara and Kaylin emerge and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "We will speak to the traitor," the voice called, "the human whore who sold her people to monsters. Let her come forward, or we detonate what remains and take as many vampires with us as we can." Kaylin's hand tightened on hers, but Alara pulled free. "Let me," she said. "This is my people doing this. Let me try to reach them." Against every instinct he nodded, trusting the bond between them to warn if she was in true danger. Alara walked across the burning courtyard alone, her white and black gown smudged with ash, the bite mark on her throat still visible. She stopped 10 feet from the masked figures and met their eyes without flinching. "What do you want?" she asked simply. The leader pulled off his mask, revealing a young man with wild eyes and a face streaked with tears. "Gareth," he said, "my name is Gareth, and I want you to know what you have done. My sister was killed in a vampire raid 5 years ago, drained and left in a ditch like garbage. The treaty will not bring her back. Your marriage will not erase the centuries of slaughter. Vampires will never respect humans. This peace is a lie, and you are helping them sell it. We are willing to die to expose the truth." Alara felt the bond pulse with Kaylin's concern, but she stayed focused on Gareth. "I was sold like livestock by my own father," she said quietly, "dragged onto an auction block in chains because I was different. I could have let this world burn. I could have chosen bitterness and vengeance. But I chose to believe we can be better." She reached up and pulled her veil away, exposing the bite mark clearly. "See this?" she said. "This is the bond that connects me to the Vampire King. It is real. It is permanent. And it means that if you kill tonight, you prove the worst people on both sides right. You prove that humans and vampires cannot coexist. You give ammunition to every radical who wants war. But if you lower your weapons and help me prove them wrong, you honor your sister's memory better than any explosion ever could." Gareth stared at her, his weapon trembling in his hands. "How do I forgive what was done to her?" he asked, and his voice broke. "How do I let that go?" "You do not," Alara said gently. "Not today. Maybe not ever. But you can choose not to create another grieving sibling. You can choose to be part of building a future where fewer sisters die in ditches. Start there." For 30 seconds nothing moved. Then Gareth lowered his weapon and dropped to his knees. 3 of the other masked figures did the same, removing their masks and revealing young faces marked by grief and fury. The 5th hesitated, then screamed something incoherent and detonated his remaining bomb. The explosion was contained, killing only himself, his body obliterated in fire and force. Guards rushed forward to secure the surrendered attackers, while healers tended to the injured delegates. Alara stood in the center of the devastation, her gown smoking at the hem, and felt Kaylin appear at her side. Together they faced the crowd of witnesses, human and vampire alike. Alara's voice rang clear despite her exhaustion. "We have married not just each other but our people's futures," she said. "The bond holds if we hold it together. There will be more attacks, more resistance, more people like Gareth who have lost loved ones and cannot see past their pain. But we will face each challenge with the same commitment. We will investigate past atrocities on both sides through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We will document what was done and by whom. We will provide justice where possible, and acknowledgement where justice is impossible. We will prove that peace is not forgetting the past, but choosing a different future despite it." The speech was broadcast through enchanted mirrors to town squares across both territories, her image appearing in 100 locations simultaneously. Millions watched a human queen stand bloodied and exhausted beside her vampire king, promising not easy peace but hard work towards something better. The response was mixed, but the moderates on both sides found hope in her words. Kaylin added his own voice, deeper and carrying centuries of authority. "My queen speaks truth," he said. "This bond we have formed is both personal and political. It proves that merger is possible. We invite any who doubt to come to Nighthaven to see for yourselves what we are building. The door remains open to those who choose partnership over domination." The crowd dispersed slowly, and Alara felt the adrenaline drain from her body, leaving only exhaustion. Kaylin caught her as her knees buckled and carried her back inside, while the bond between them hummed with shared relief. They had survived the ceremony. They had survived the attack. Now came the harder work of making the promises real. 3 months passed like water through fingers, time measured not in days, but in small victories accumulated until they formed something substantial. The treaty was holding despite predictions of its collapse, border skirmishes decreasing by 60% as both human and vampire patrols learned to coordinate rather than confront. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had begun its hearings in a neutral location on the border, vampires and humans sitting together to document centuries of atrocities committed by both sides. The sessions were painful and necessary, victims speaking their trauma aloud, while those responsible faced accountability they had long evaded. Alara attended when she could, listening to stories that broke her heart and reminded her why this work mattered. She and Kaylin had settled into a rhythm of joint governance that surprised even their supporters with its effectiveness. She handled human relations and social reforms, traveling to border towns to meet with mayors and councils, negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchanges. He managed vampire politics and military restraint, walking the delicate line between maintaining security and avoiding provocation. They met each evening in Kaylin's study to share intelligence and coordinate strategy, their bond allowing them to sense each other's moods even before words were spoken. The personal dimension of their marriage had deepened in ways Alara had not anticipated. They had consummated the union a week after the ceremony in the privacy of their shared chambers, an experience that was tender and careful and profoundly intimate. Kaylin had been patient beyond measure, letting her set the pace, focused entirely on her comfort and trust. The bond between them had flared during the act, silver light filling the room as their emotions merged completely. Afterward, they had lain tangled together while he traced patterns on her skin, and she felt more completely seen than ever in her life. She had learned to sense when he was troubled, even when he tried to hide it, feeling the tension through the bond like a taut wire. He had learned to read her silences, understanding when she needed space to process and when she needed his presence. They were becoming something more than political partners, more than reluctant allies bound by necessity. They were becoming a unit. Challenges arose constantly, testing the fragile peace they had built. A human town called Millbrook refused to accept vampire trade caravans, the mayor citing centuries of distrust and recent memories of raids. Alara traveled there personally with only Rowan as escort, sitting in the town hall and speaking to frightened citizens who saw her as either savior or traitor. "I was once as afraid as you are," she told them. "I was sold to vampires against my will. I thought I would die. But I chose to see them as individuals rather than monsters, and some of them proved worthy of that choice. Not all, but enough. Give the caravans a chance. If they violate your trust, we will enforce consequences. But if you refuse contact, you guarantee that nothing ever changes." The mayor had agreed to a trial period, and the first caravan had passed through without incident, trading vampire-crafted goods for human grain. It was a small victory, but Alara collected them like precious stones. A vampire clan in the Western Territories violated the treaty by feeding on a human without proper documentation. The act consensual but lacking the required witnesses and medical oversight that new laws demanded. Kaylin enforced penalties personally, stripping the clan leader of land rights and imposing fines that made clear the law applied equally to vampires. Some of the more traditional council members had grumbled about weakness, but the moderates supported him, understanding that credibility required consistency. Kieran had observed it all with his characteristic mix of cynicism and growing belief. He found Alara in the library one afternoon while she was reviewing petitions from human villages requesting vampire assistance with infrastructure projects. "You two are disgustingly effective together," he said, sprawling in a chair with dramatic flair. "I am almost starting to believe in this peace nonsense." "Give it time," Alara said without looking up. "We will convert you fully." The younger vampire laughed, but there was genuine warmth in it. "My brother is different since you came," he said more seriously. "Lighter somehow, less crushed by duty. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." Alara had transformed in those 3 months, from the frightened girl dragged onto an auction block to someone she barely recognized. She was confident now, moving through Vampire Court with ease, negotiating with human diplomats without hesitation. Her strategies were sharp, and her compassion was tactical, deployed where it would have maximum impact. The council had come to respect her judgment even when it challenged their assumptions. Humans increasingly saw her as a bridge rather than a traitor, someone who understood their fears because she had lived them. She wore her white hair unbound most days, no longer hiding what made her different. The violet eyes that had once marked her as cursed now marked her as queen. The transformation was not without cost. News arrived one gray morning that Marcus had died in the labor colony where he had been serving his sentence. Illness, the report said, some fever that his weakened body could not fight. There had been no violence, no drama, just a man fading away while performing the restitution he owed. Alara received the news in her study and felt nothing at first, the information sliding past emotion into simple fact. Then came a complex tangle of grief for what might have been, relief that the question of him was finally resolved, and residual anger at what he had done. She organized a small memorial service in the palace chapel, inviting only those who had known him during his labor service. A handful of vampires came, guards and supervisors who reported that Marcus had worked hard and complained little, that he had seemed to understand his crimes and accept their weight. Alara stood before a simple candle and spoke words she had prepared. "I hope you found peace," she said quietly, "even if you never gave it to me. I hope in your final months you understood why I saved you and what I was trying to build. I forgive you not because you earned it, but because carrying anger was poisoning me. Rest now." She did not cry, but she lit the candle and watched it burn while Helena stood beside her in silent support. Afterward, she returned to work because grief was a luxury she could not afford when so many depended on her strength. Evening found Alara and Kaelin on the palace roof, their private retreat away from court politics and endless demands. It had become their ritual, this quiet hour at sunset where the world felt smaller and more manageable. Alara sat with a book of human poetry open in her lap, reading verses about love and loss, while Kaelin reviewed treaty amendments beside her. They did not speak much, simply existed in comfortable silence, with the bond humming contentedly between them. The sun was setting over the Shadowvale forest when the messenger arrived, a young vampire guard who climbed the stairs with obvious reluctance. He bowed deeply and handed Kaelin a sealed letter marked with unfamiliar insignia. "My king," the guard said. "Urgent news from the Southern Territories." Kaelin broke the seal and read in silence, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he handed the letter to Alara without comment. She scanned the contents and felt ice spread through her stomach. A radical vampire faction deep in the Southern Territories had declared independence and rejected the treaty outright. They were led by someone calling herself the Scarlet Empress, a vampire of unknown age and considerable power. Her manifesto was brief and brutal. The peace accords were weakness, humans were prey, and she would prove it by resuming raids on human villages. 3 settlements had already been attacked, their populations drained and left as warnings. "This is the real test," Kaelin said quietly, staring out over the darkening landscape. "If we cannot stop this without triggering a larger war, then everything we have built collapses. The moderates will lose faith, and the radicals will seize power. We have weeks at most before the human government demands military response." Alara closed the poetry book and set it aside, her mind already calculating strategies and consequences. "Then we go together," she said firmly. "We have proven unity works here in Nighthaven. We will prove it everywhere. We take a combined force, human and vampire soldiers working in coordination. We demonstrate that the treaty has teeth and that violations will be met with overwhelming joint response. We show the Scarlet Empress that her vision of the past is already obsolete." Kaelin looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, pride mixing with concern. "You would go into battle," he said. "You would risk yourself when you could stay safe here." "I was sold for being different," Elara replied. "Now I fight for everyone who has ever been cast aside. That includes the humans in those southern villages who are dying because someone rejects the future we are building. I will not hide while others pay the price for my choices." The bond flared between them, silver light visible even in the fading sunset. Kaelin took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing her knuckles with reverent care. "Then we prepare," he said. "We mobilize forces, coordinate with human military command, and march south within the week. We end this threat together and prove that the new order is stronger than the old." They stood together at the edge of the roof parapet, looking out over the kingdom they were reshaping through will and partnership. Elara wore a gown of midnight blue tonight, but in her mind she was already planning the symbolic armor she would commission, something that blended human and vampire aesthetics into a statement of unified power. She would stand on the battlefield not in chains but crowned, not as property but as sovereign. Kaelin stood beside her in black and silver, his white hair catching the last light, and together they were silhouetted against the rising moon. Two figures who should have been enemies, who should have destroyed each other, instead bound by magic and choice into something unprecedented. The camera of history would pull back from this moment, see them small against the vastness of the palace and the forest and the mountains beyond. Two people facing an uncertain future with joined hands and unshaken resolve. "I was sold for being different," Elara thought, as stars began appearing overhead. "Now I will fight for everyone who has ever been cast aside, everyone who was told they were less, everyone who refused to accept the world as it was, and dared to imagine it could be better." The bond pulsed between them, visible as faint silver light wrapping around their joined hands, and she squeezed his fingers tight. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The story could fade here on this image of unity and determination, on the promise of challenges overcome and battles yet to fight. But in the blood archives far below, Lady Morgana was conducting research into historical bonds, trying to understand why Elara and Kaelin's connection was so much stronger than precedent suggested. She pulled an ancient tome from the restricted section, its cover marked with symbols that predated the current vampire kingdoms. The pages were brittle, and the text was written in a language she had not read in centuries, but she translated slowly by candlelight. "When the Pale Queen and the Lonely King unite," the prophecy read, "the old powers will wake. What was sundered shall be made whole. What was forgotten shall remember." The bond of equal measure breaks the ancient separation and calls forth that which sleeps in the deep places of the world. Beware the waking, for it brings both salvation and destruction in equal measure. Morgana stared at the words and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She closed the book carefully and extinguished the candle, standing alone in the darkness of the archives. "This is not over," she whispered to the empty room. "This is only beginning." Far to the south, the Scarlet Empress stood on a balcony overlooking her occupied territories and smiled as she received news of the palace mobilization. "Let them come," she said to her advisors. "Let the Pale Queen and her pet king march south with their precious unity. They have no idea what they have truly awakened. The pieces are moving exactly as the old text predicted. Soon everything changes." The scene held on her crimson smile, on the burning villages in the distance, on the storm clouds gathering on the southern horizon. Then darkness, complete and waiting, pregnant with the promise of conflict and revelation still to come. The bond between Elara and Kaelin glowed faintly even in the black, a silver thread connecting them across distance and time, holding steady against whatever trials awaited. Two people who had been strangers, who had been brought together by desperation and biology, who had chosen each other when choice seemed impossible. Their story was not ending but transforming, expanding from personal struggle to existential conflict. The auction block where it began was 3 months and a lifetime behind them. The battlefield ahead would test everything they had built, but they would face it as they had faced everything since that first terrible night. Together, bonded, unbreakable. The silver light pulsed once more, and then the screen went dark, leaving only the echo of a question. What old powers had they awakened, and what would it cost to face them when they finally rose?